shift focus. At noon Eastern, they'll consider a judicial nomination. They'll vote on that nomination at about 12:15 Eastern. Lawmakers will break from 12:30 to 2:15 for their weekly party caucus lunches. And now, live Senate coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
We'll lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Sovereign God and ultimate ruler of this nation, as our lawmakers remember their accountability to you, use them to protect the blessing of liberty. Continue to provide encouragement and support to the members of their staffs who help provide for the security and well-being of the citizens of this land. Lord, cover us all with your protection and providence, and may your gracious benediction give us peace this day and evermore. Keep our thoughts clear, our words wise, and our hearts pure. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., November 8, 2011. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jean Shaheen, a senator from the state of New Hampshire, to perform the duties of the chair. Son Daniel K. Noe, President pro tempore.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for an hour. Majority will control the first half. Following that morning business, we'll resume consideration of the motion to proceed H.R. 674. At noon, the Senate will be in executive session to consider the nomination of Evan Wallach, the United States Circuit Judge for the Federal Circuit. At 12:15 p.m., the United States will, I was behind myself a little there. I'm sorry about that. At 12:15, the Senate will vote on confirmation of the Wallach nomination. Following that vote, the Senate will be in recess until 2:15 p.m. to allow for our weekly caucus meetings. Expect to be in consideration of H.R. 674 today. Senators will be notified when additional votes are scheduled. Madam President, there are two bills at the desk. They're both due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bills for the second time.
H.R. 2930, an act to amend the securities laws to provide for registration exemptions for certain crowd-funded securities and for other purposes. H.R. 2940, an act to direct the Securities and Exchange Commission to eliminate the prohibition against general solicitation as a requirement for a certain exemption under Regulation D.
I object to any further proceedings with respect to these two bills.
Objections having been heard, the bills will be placed on the calendar under Rule 14.
Madam President, yesterday my friend, the Republican leader, kicked off a list of bills he believes Democrats and Republicans can agree. I couldn't help but notice that the vow to hire heroes legislation that would give tax cuts to companies that hire out of work disabled veterans wasn't on that list he ticked off. The bill that I just referred to, the vow to hire heroes, ought to be free of even a whiff of controversy. House Republicans already voted for the major component of that bill, a plan to give older veterans access to job training so they can keep up with the rapidly changing workplace and help young veterans transition from active duty service to civilian workplace. The bill wouldn't add a dime to the deficit, so there should be no objection there. It's paid for with a non-controversial extension of an existing fee on VA-backed mortgages. It's a version of the same way House Republicans already voted for this matter. Republicans have supported tax credits for companies that hire work and disabled veterans in the past, so that can't be the holdup. And we'll pass this important legislation as an amendment to a bill sent over from the House to repeal a 3% withholding provision from government contractors. Republicans have been champing at the bit to pass this measure, so the House vehicle for Vow to Hire Heroes is not a source of their radio silence, I'm sure. There are no procedural or philosophical hurdles to passing this bill. But don't take my word for it, Madam President. Jeff Miller, a Republican chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, said about this bipartisan legislation yesterday, I quote, "Today, we're putting aside politics and putting veterans first. This is how the process should work." The VOW Act, which passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support, provides the framework for this legislation and gets to the root of many of the employment problems our veterans face. End of quote. And with nearly 250,000 Iraq and Afghanistan veterans unemployed, this legislation can't come a moment too soon. Yet, Senate Republicans remain curiously silent on this legislation. It's inconceivable that my Republican colleagues believe this legislation to be unnecessary. But it also seemed unthinkable that Republicans would unanimously oppose the legislation to create hundreds of thousands of jobs for teachers, police officers, firefighters, and construction workers. Here's what's at stake. The number of unemployed post-9/11 veterans has gone up by 30,000 in the last year alone. Nearly 250,000 men and women who volunteered to fight overseas for the flag and the freedoms and privileges it represents can't find a job here at home. And that number will only grow as the two wars draw to a close. 1 in 5 young veterans under age 25, they're unemployed. And on any given night, at least 75,000 veterans, including 2,500 in Nevada, sleep on the streets. They're homeless. We should all be able to agree that even one night is too many for our nation's heroes to pass without a roof over their heads. And young veterans are more than twice as likely as their peers to be homeless and 4 times as likely to live in poverty. During tough economic times, when some young people join the military for a way to escape the cycle of poverty, this statistic is shocking and disheartening. So I call on the minority leader and the rest of my Republican colleagues to break the silence. Where do they stand on the Vow to Hire Heroes Act? I ask my Republican colleagues, do you believe we should lend a helping hand to those who defend our freedom? Of course. Or do you think this nation's responsibility to its veterans ends the day they take off that uniform? Andrew Carnegie once said that the older he got, the less mind he paid to what men say. I just watch what they do, he said. So I remind my Republican friends, the men and women of the United States Armed Forces, those who wear the uniform today and those who wore it once, are watching what my Republican colleagues do.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
It's now been 2 months since the President came before Congress and outlined his plan for tackling the jobs crisis, a plan that can best be described as a rehash of the same failed policies of the past few years, disguised as a bipartisan overture, a political strategy masquerading as a serious legislative proposal. The President put this plan together knowing Republicans would oppose it. In other words, it was actually designed to fail, as the White House aides have readily admitted to reporters for weeks. This was not, I repeat, a serious effort to do something about jobs and the economy. It was a serious effort to help the President's re-election campaign by making Republicans in Congress look intransigent. So what I've been saying for the past few weeks is let's put the political games aside. We'll have time for that next year in the election. The American people want us to do something about jobs right now. It appears the message may finally be breaking through. I was just listening to my friend, the Majority Leader, talking about the measure before us, something we support and look forward to passing. It's been championed by Senator Scott Brown of Massachusetts, would help contractors who do business with the government. And I was also glad to see that the Veterans Bill, which contains many provisions supported by Republicans, will be the first amendment. So maybe we're making some progress here. This is just the kind of thing we've been calling for, just the kind of thing we should be doing a lot more of around here. There's a lot we can agree on when it comes to jobs legislation, and that's where the focus should actually be. While the President's been out on bus tours, Republicans in the House have been debating and passing bipartisan legislation aimed at making it easier for businesses across the country to grow and to create jobs. And over the past 2 weeks, I've highlighted some of their good work. Yesterday, I mentioned in particular a bill the House passed just last week called the Small Company Capital Formation Act, H.R. 1070, a bill that received 421 votes, including 183 Democratic votes. Only one person in the entire 435-member House of Representatives voted against the bill. Just one. And President Obama endorsed the idea contained in this bill in his job speech a couple of months ago. The question is, why in the world wouldn't the Democratic majority take it up and pass it right here in the Senate? If Democrats are more interested in passing legislation that helps put Americans back to work than they are in raising taxes, they should at least work with us to pass the bills the President himself has endorsed. So this morning I want to say again how pleased I am that we'll be taking up Senator Brown's 3% withholding bill to help ease the burden on government contractors, and that we'll have a vote on and hopefully debate the Veterans Bill. And I'd like to call on the Democratic majority in the Senate to keep it up by taking up H.R. 1070 or its bipartisan Senate companion bill, S. 1544, sponsored by Senator Toomey and Tester. Take up this legislation that's already passed the House with the support of almost everybody over there, and show the American people that you care more about creating jobs than in creating campaign slogans. Let's not make the bills we'll be voting on today the exception, but the rule around here. Why don't we just keep it up? Right now, small, growing businesses aren't expanding their businesses through a public offering because they simply can't afford the high cost of government paperwork they're required to manage. Instead of going out there and raising money to grow and hire, they're holding back. They're not expanding, and if they're not expanding, they're not hiring. This bill would remove some of that burden from smaller businesses and help them gain access to new capital that they can invest in their businesses and their employees. Yesterday, I mentioned the CEO of a pharmaceutical company in Pennsylvania who says he's got the CEO of a pharmaceutical company in Pennsylvania who says he's got a promising new drug for treating chronic kidney disease actually in the pipeline, but that he can't take it to the next level because of all the regulatory costs that his company is too small to afford right now. We should be removing barriers for smaller companies like his. Nearly 200 House Democrats agree with that, and so does President Obama. As I said yesterday, this bill is about as bipartisan as it gets. The only thing standing in the way of passing it in the Senate are the Democrats who schedule legislation around here. And the only reason they could after blocking it is that it steps on the campaign strategy. Well, I think that's a mistake. I think the American people can see Republicans in the House passing all of these bipartisan bills aimed at spurring job creation, and they wonder why Senate Democrats won't actually take them up. This should be easy. They've already done the hard work of finding jobs bills that we know could pass both chambers and that the President would probably sign. Let's take up Senator Toomey and Senator Tester's bipartisan companion bill to House Bill S, to the House bill. Their bill is S. 1544, and let's pass it. And then let's send it to the President for a signature so it can become law. If you're creating jobs, you should be for this bill. As the AP put it last month, companies use the cash they raise to grow, and that means hiring people. And at a time when 14 million Americans are looking for work and the unemployment rate has been stuck near 9% for 2 years, the last thing the economy needs is for one engine of hiring to stall. A recent report by NASDAQ of companies that went public from 2001 to 2009 found that those companies increased their collective workforce by 70% after making the initial public offering. 70% increase in employment after making an initial public offering. What this bill does is enable more companies to take that leap and start hiring once they have. This is just the kind of thing we should be doing more of in the Senate. Let's put the partisan bills aside. Let's focus on bipartisan legislation instead. Why don't we just shoot for success? Now, Madam President, on another matter, last week, the White House announced that Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki of Iraq will be meeting with the President here on December the 12th. This meeting comes at an important time as our own military forces will be drawing down their presence within Iraq, and the future of our bilateral security relationship remains very uncertain. But our withdrawal from Iraq raises another important matter that I hope the President will raise with Prime Minister Maliki, and which highlights some of the difficulties that will result from military drawdown there and eventually in Afghanistan as well. Both of these drawdowns the President has ordered. What I'm referring to is the law of war detention. In July of this year, Senate Republicans wrote to Secretary of Defense Panetta concerning the custody of al-Musa Daduq, the senior Hezbollah operative currently in our joint custody in Iraq. Daduq is in joint custody in Iraq between the U.S. and the Iraqi government. In 2005, Daduq was directed by senior Hezbollah leaders to travel to Iran, where he trained Iraqi extremists in the use of explosively formed penetrators, mortars, and other terrorist tactics. Among other things, Daduq is suspected of orchestrating a kidnapping in Karbala, Iraq, 4 years ago that resulted in the murder of 5 U.S. military personnel. And it's a safe bet that Daduq is transferred to Iraqi control, that he will return to the fight against the United States. President Obama should insist in his meeting with Prime Minister Maliki that the U.S. forces retain custody of Daduq and transport him to the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. The detention of Daduq touches on 3 important issues in the ongoing war on terror. First, with the withdrawal of our military presence from Iraq, the U.S. will lose the ability to detain enemy combatants like Daduq in Iraq. Current plans are for the United States military to have completed our transition to the security forces of Afghanistan by the end of 2014. And we should expect that we will lose the ability to detain enemy combatants there as well. Our military commanders in Afghanistan should therefore anticipate losing the ability to detain enemy combatants by that date. As we saw in the capture of Abdul Warsame, the Somali terrorist accused of providing material support to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and al-Shabaab, and detained on a U.S. Navy ship at sea, there remains a strong likelihood that our military and intelligence community will need a secure detention facility to house these foreign fighters. The issue of what are you going to do with them? Rather than being kept in military custody overseas, Warsame was flown into the United States and placed in the civilian system. But the logical place for long-term or indefinite detention of foreign fighters like Warsame is not on a ship at sea or in our private prison system, but rather, as I've said many times before, at the secure detention facility at Guantanamo. Second, it is worth noting that the Obama administration has tied its own hands in the matter of indefinite detention of enemy combatants. The administration's plan to buy a prison in Illinois for conversion to a military detention facility makes clear that the President does not oppose law of war detention. He's fine with bringing foreign fighters into the U.S. and indefinitely detaining them in military facilities inside our borders, and yet he opposes detaining them indefinitely at a military facility at Guantanamo, where they will benefit from humane treatment, but they won't enjoy the legal rights of detainees who are brought here, including the possibility of release into the United States. Third, the executive orders signed by the President in January 2009 were issued with an eye toward fulfilling candidate Obama's campaign promises, rather than after conducting a serious review of sound counterterrorism policy. And now, 3 years after taking office, the President has had enough firsthand experience dealing with terrorism to know that many of the terrorists held at Guantanamo can't be sent back to places like Yemen, where they're likely to return to the fight. But the President's own executive order have denied our military commanders and our intelligence community the certainty they need when they capture, detain, and interrogate terrorist suspects. His early executive orders, for instance, ended the CIA's detention program and directed the closing of Guantanamo. The order to close Guantanamo makes little sense. So it's not Republicans who are tying the President's hands in prosecuting the war on terror. He did that himself with the short-sighted executive orders he signed during his first days in office. As our country withdraws from Iraq and transitions further responsibilities to the Afghan security forces in Afghanistan, we will need a place to send foreign fighters like Warsame and Daduk. That place is the military detention facility at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. In his discussions with Prime Minister Maliki, the President should, of course, discuss the role the U.S. military will play in Iraq after the end of this year, and how our two countries can work together to preserve the gains made through the sacrifice of so many brave Americans, and to combat Iranian influence. But in addition to these important matters, the President should also insist that Prime Minister retain custody of Daduk and send him to Guantanamo as soon as possible. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half.
Madam President.
The Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I listened carefully to this statement made by the minority leader, Senator McConnell, the Republican leader. His last statement was about the military drawdown in Iraq. There are some of us on the Senate floor who were here 10 years ago when the vote was taken on the invasion of Iraq. 23 of us voted no, 1 Republican and 22 Democrats, because we felt the focus of American military power and energy should be to avenge what happened on 9/11 by focusing our resources and the great men and women in uniform on Afghanistan and al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. President Bush and his supporters believed otherwise. They called for a war in another country, in Iraq, a country which was not implicated in any way with what happened on 9/11. 23 of us thought that was a mistake. Well, here we are almost 10 years later. We have spent $1 trillion in Iraq. We have lost over 4,400 of our brave men and women who served in uniform. And now we have a leadership in Iraq which is suspect. Maliki, the leader, has shown in the past to be close to the Iranians, not our friends and not the friends of Western values. I'm unhappy with that outcome, but when you deal with democracy or some form of it, the people of a country choose their leaders. That's the reality. And so President Bush, before he left office, negotiated a timetable to bring American troops home from Iraq, and the timetable called for that to happen by the end of this year. And so what President Obama did when he came into office was to take this planned withdrawal of American troops by President Bush and implement it. Now, there came a question at the end whether all of the troops would leave or some would stay. What President Obama tried to negotiate was a guarantee that if American troops stayed in Iraq, they would not be charged and tried in Iraqi courts, that they would be subject to punishment for wrongdoing, but it would be under the premise that it would, as in most cases, it would be done under American military law. Mr. Maliki and the Iraqis said no, and the President said, we are not going to leave our men and women in uniform in Iraq subject to a government and courts that may not treat them justly or fairly. I think the President made the right decision. I think if he'd have made the other decision and said leave them there and let the Iraqi prosecutors do what they wish, we would have heard speeches on the floor from the other side about what an outrage it is to put American soldiers in harm's way and jeopardy of an Iraqi military justice system or justice system that may be unfair and unjust. The President said no, our troops will come home. Now comes the criticism that we're leaving from the Republican side of the aisle, leaving under a timetable established by President George W. Bush, leaving because President Obama could not get a guarantee of fair treatment of American soldiers if they stayed. What else would a president do? And then the argument is made, well, the problem we have is that we may reach a point where some of the people accused of terrorism now being held in Iraq, we're not certain what's going to happen with them now. It's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. But Senator McConnell, he is consistent, believes that we should not ever consider bringing such a foreign person accused of terrorism into America's judicial and court system. He argues that since this is a war and these are terrorists involved in the war, these people should all be directed to military courts in the United States, military tribunals. We've had that argument on the floor. In fact, we had the debate and we had the vote when Senator Ayotte offered it just a week or two ago. And the majority sentiment in the United States Senate reflects a reality. And here's the reality, Madam President. Since 9/11/2001, more than 300 terrorists have been successfully prosecuted in the Article III criminal courts of America. So even those who are foreign-born, like the most recent one, the underwear bomber, do you remember the story? He's on a plane, headed to Detroit, tried to detonate a bomb. His clothes caught on fire. They put out the fire, arrested him. He pled guilty just a few weeks ago in America's criminal courts. He was prosecuted by the Department of Justice, investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and pled guilty. He wasn't the first. In fact, since 9/11, more than 300 accused terrorists have been successfully prosecuted in our courts, the same courts that Senator McConnell questions whether they could adequately protect America. 300 times they have. 300 times accused terrorists have gone to jail. How many have been prosecuted in military tribunals in that same period of time? 3. 300 to 3 if you're keeping score. What I say is this president and any president should have the power to make the right decision as to where someone should be prosecuted. If it's in our court system, so be it. And there's ample evidence that the FBI and our prosecutors are up to that task. If it's in a military tribunal, so be it. Let the president make that decision. Senator McConnell sees it otherwise. And he believes that it is a mistake to go to our criminal courts. I would just ask him, if he believes that, to explain the score, 300 to 3 over the last 10 years. And one last point. This notion that we cannot safely incarcerate convicted terrorists in American prisons has been proven wrong 300 times since 9/11. These men have been sent to American prisons all around the United States, including Marion, Illinois, where we house convicted terrorists. And I will tell you, I've been down to southern Illinois recently, and people are not running, screaming in the streets because 4 or 5 people convicted of terrorism are sitting in the Marion Federal Penitentiary. Our people who work there will take care of those folks. And the folks who live around that community have no fear. I might add, too, that Senator McConnell is mistaken in referring to the Thompson prison. Allow me to say a brief word about something that means a lot to me. 10 years ago, my state built a prison in Thompson, Illinois. and then didn't have enough money to open it. It's been sitting there largely empty for a decade. Now the state of Illinois is prepared to sell it to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The Federal Bureau of Prisons negotiated a good price, good for the state of Illinois and good for us. Saves us about $35 million over building a new prison. So we get a pretty good deal as federal taxpayers, and Illinois gets a 10-year-old prison it's not using sold. Well, that's pretty good and creates a lot of local jobs. This has the support not only of myself, but the Republican senator from Illinois, Senator Mark Kirk, and the Republican congressman who represent this area. We all support this. And the notion that Guantanamo detainees are coming to Thompson is a dead issue. The president proposed it initially. I had no objection to it, but it was clear that the political sentiment on Capitol Hill opposed it. I accepted that. I accepted political defeat, if you will, on this issue, and said so be it. No Guantanamo detainees can ever go to the Thompson prison if that's what it takes to close the deal. The president agreed to it. Attorney General Eric Holder sent a letter confirming it. Senator Kirk, who felt very strongly about this, acknowledged that this letter made it clear this administration was not going to transfer those prisoners to Thompson. And here it comes back on the floor today. Well, I can just say to my friend Senator McConnell, I hope he will sit down with Senator Kirk, who will explain this is no longer an issue. I'm not fighting this issue. The president isn't fighting it. There will be no Guantanamo detainees at Thompson. Let's do something right for our Bureau of Prisons and right, I hope, for my home state of Illinois. The last point I'd like to make is on a separate issue, and I'd like to make it very briefly. We're going to consider a veterans bill today on veterans unemployment, and we'll vote on it soon, in the next day or two. It is a bipartisan bill, and it should be. It is a bill that's based on President Obama's jobs bill, which said that in addition to all the other unemployed in America, we should give special help to our returning veterans. I remember the president's speech at the joint session of Congress. Members on the Republican side didn't jump up and applaud very often, but they sure did when the president said we ought to help our veterans. They fought for America. They shouldn't come back home and fight for a job. Let's give them a helping hand. Everybody stood up and applauded, as we should. And so this bill provides incentives for people to hire unemployed veterans. We estimate there are about 240,000 of these veterans. And the tax credits that are being offered and all the other counseling and assistance is paid for in the bill. And it appears now that this bill, inspired by President Obama's jobs bill, and added to it, I might add, the work of the Senate Veterans Committee under Senator Patty Murray, is likely to pass on a bipartisan basis, and it should, in time for Veterans Day. But let me add another point, if I can. I want to help these 240,000 veterans and all veterans go to work. That's something that we have a duty, a solemn moral duty to see happen. But don't forget, there are 14 million unemployed Americans. President Obama's bill goes beyond veterans and says there are many other people needing a helping hand. Help the veterans first. Okay, I'm for that. I sign up. But keep on the topic, keep on the subject of putting America back to work. And unfortunately now, on 3 separate occasions, we've called President Obama's jobs bill on the floor, and we couldn't get one single Republican senator to vote for it. Not one. And their reason is very clear, and they're very explicit about it. President Obama pays for his jobs bill by imposing a surtax on those making over $1 million a year. In other words, if you're making more than $20,000 a week in income in America, you're going to pay a little more. It's about 5% for the money earned over $1 million. And the Republicans have come to the floor and said clearly, no deal. We will not agree to any jobs bill that imposes any new tax burden on the wealthiest people in America. That's their position. They're very open about that position. Who disagrees with that? Virtually everyone in this country. Overwhelming majority of Democrats and independents and a majority of Republicans and a majority of Tea Party members say it's not unfair to ask the wealthiest to pay a little more in taxes to get the American economy working again and get people back to work. That's what the president proposes. So today, as we pass this veterans, or start to pass this week, this veterans bill, remember, it started in the president's jobs bill. It is now bipartisan, as it should be, and we shouldn't stop here. We need to continue the effort. Last week, we tried to put money into rebuilding America, infrastructure across America, roads, highways, airports, mass transit. Couldn't get a single Republican to support us, not one. I guess a week before that, we said, well, let's try to focus on teachers, policemen, and firefighters who are losing their jobs. Let's try to make sure they don't lose as many as it might happen if we didn't act. And we couldn't get a single Republican to support that either. They will not support any provision of the President's jobs bill that adds 1 penny in new taxes to a millionaire in America. That's their standard. That's what they're using. The Veterans bill doesn't do that, so they said they'll go along with it. But it really begs the question. If we are serious about dealing with this recession and putting people back to work, let's not stop with the veterans of America. Let's start with the veterans of America, and let's do the right thing by them and the rest of this country. A payroll tax cut for working Americans so they have more money, struggling paycheck to paycheck, more money to get by, makes sense. They'll spend that money. They'll need to. On the necessities of life and the purchase of goods and services that will create more jobs. Secondly, tax credits to hire those who are unemployed. Third, making certain that we invest in infrastructure, not only what I mentioned, roads and highways, but school buildings and community colleges. Also to make sure that we do our best for the policemen, firefighters, and teachers who are facing layoffs all across America. Those ought to be priorities. They're the President's priorities. They should be our priorities in the Senate. Though the President has strong bipartisan support for what he is setting out to do, the sad reality is we have little or no support so far when it comes to votes in the United States Senate. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I thank the distinguished senator from Illinois for his remarks on topics that are very dear to us, and I commend him for his advocacy and passion in these important areas. Now, I was here last week in this chamber to discuss a variety of areas in which the American people aren't getting a straight deal compared to special interests and folks who have a lot of power for themselves and their industries here in Washington. In that speech, I proposed a number of concrete steps that we could take to help restore the balance of power in our nation between ordinary American people on the one hand and the giant corporations and special interests that give themselves special deals and privileges that the American people don't share on the other hand. Today I'm here to introduce legislation to take one of those steps, and that is to protect ordinary consumers from runaway interest rates on credit cards from Wall Street banks. This is something that has gone unchecked for far too long. In the last Congress, we passed 2 pieces of banking legislation. We passed the Credit Card Act, which ended some of the worst tricks and traps hidden in credit card contracts. And we passed the Dodd-Frank Act, which restructured our system of financial regulation and created a new agency to protect consumers from hazardous mortgages and credit cards. Regrettably, one particularly bad practice was not addressed in either of those 2 pieces of legislation, and that is the runaway credit card interest rates that families are too often burdened with. I'll add it's not just families. I went through Olneyville in Providence about 2 weeks ago and spoke to a small business owner who was having tough times. And his bank had pulled his line of credit, so he was having to fund his business off his credit card. And they had bumped his credit card rate up to, you guessed it, 30%. The Empowering States' Rights to Protect Consumers Act, which I'm introducing today, would pick up where the Credit Card Act and Dodd-Frank left off by restoring to our 50 sovereign states the power, which they have properly had through the vast bulk of the history of this republic, to protect their home state consumers with limits on credit card and other loan interest rates. This is not a new power to states. This is not a new principle or idea. This is the restoration of a historic states' right which was just eliminated a few decades ago. Madam President, when you and I were growing up, a credit card offer with a 20% or 30% interest rate might be something to bring to the attention of law enforcement. Such interest rates were illegal under most states' laws. Today, in contrast, credit card companies routinely charge rates of 30% or more. You may not know it going into your credit card agreement that that's where you're going to end up. They may have a teaser rate up front that is a lower rate, but make one of those mistakes in that 20-page long contract that is full of tricks and traps, and pow, there you are at 30%. So what happened between our childhood, when a 30% interest rate was something to bring to the attention of law enforcement, and now when ordinary families are bedeviled with 30% interest rates on their credit cards? Well, before 1978, which is for the first 202 years of the American Republic, each state had the ability to enforce usury laws, interest rate limits, to protect their citizens. Our economy grew and flourished during those 2 centuries, and lenders profited while complying with the laws in effect where they operated. Then came 1978, and a seemingly uneventful Supreme Court case. It was little noticed at the time that it was decided. In Marquette National Bank of Minneapolis versus First of Omaha Service Corporation, the Supreme Court had to decide what state's law to apply when the bank was domiciled in one state, but the customer lived in a different state. And the court looked at the word located in the National Bank Act of 1863, and it decided that it meant the location of the bank and not the location of the customer. Well, they didn't get it right away, but it did not take long before some big banks spotted the opportunity. They could avoid interest rate restrictions by reorganizing as national banks and moving to states that had weak interest rate protections and comparatively weak consumer protections. The proverbial race to the bottom followed as a small handful of states eliminated interest rate caps and degraded their consumer protections in order to attract lucrative credit card business and related tax revenue to their states. That is why the credit card divisions of major banks are based in just a few states, and why consumers in other states are often denied protection from outrageous interest rates and fees, even though those outrageous interest rates and fees are against the law of the consumer's home state. So my bill would reinstate the historic, long-standing powers of states to set interest rate caps that protect their own citizens. Let me be clear about what this bill would not do. It would not prescribe or recommend any interest rate caps, nor would it impose any other lending limitations. It is pure states' rights. It would restore to the states the power they enjoyed for over 200 years from the founding of the Republic, the power to say enough, the power to say that 30% or 50% or whatever the state deems appropriate should be the limit on interest charged to their people. Madam President, the current system isn't only unfair to consumers, It's unfair to our local lenders and retailers that continue to be bound by the laws of the state in which they're located. This is a special privilege for big national banks that can move their offices to whatever state will give them the best deal in terms of lousy consumer protection and unlimited interest rates. A small local lender has to play by the rules of fair interest rates, but gigantic national credit card companies can avoid having any rules at all. We need to level the playing field to eliminate this unfair and lucrative advantage for Wall Street banks against our local credit unions and other small lenders. When we pass this bill, states can dust off or reenact their usury statutes, most of which, at least nominally, still limit interest rates to 18% or less, and once again begin protecting their consumers from excessive interest rates. This is the historic norm in our constitutional republic. It is the 30% and over interest rates that are the recent anomaly, that are the historic peculiarity. We should go back to the historic states' rights norm, the way the Founding Fathers saw things under the doctrine of federalism, and close this modern bureaucratic loophole that allows big Wall Street banks a special deal to gouge our constituents. As I close, I want to thank Senators Levin and Durbin and Begich and Franken and Reed of Rhode Island, most significantly, my senior senator, and Sanders and Merkley for their co-sponsorship of this bill. In the past, similar legislation has garnered bipartisan support. It did so as an amendment to Dodd-Frank, indeed. And I hope my Republican colleagues will consider giving this bill a close look and joining with us. This is purely an issue of restoring the balance of power to the states and to the people of those states as voters, federalism, something I know many Republicans support in other contexts. So I ask all of my colleagues for their consideration and support, and I thank the chair and yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
Debate continues in the Senate today on repealing a 3% withholding tax for contractors. Later today, Democrats are expected to offer an amendment to the bill that would give tax credits to companies that hire unemployed veterans and that would encourage job training for outgoing service members. Also later today, senators expected to vote on the nomination of Evan Wallach to be a U.S. Circuit Court judge for the federal court. Also, as usual on Tuesdays, party lunches expected at about 12:30 Eastern Time. It's Election Day today. A Los Angeles Times writing that at stake in this off-year general election is a pair of governorships, control of several state legislatures, local office elections, and 34 statewide ballot measures on issues like collective bargaining and abortion. Two states, Mississippi and Maine, offer the latest test of a Republican drive to tighten election laws. Maine's Question 1 will give voters the chance to overturn a new law ending same-day voter registration. And in Mississippi, an initiative would enact a new requirement that voters provide photo ID at the polls. That in the Los Angeles Times. An update on some of our live coverage as we wait for a senator to speak. Attorney General Eric Holder is on Capitol Hill right now, testifying about the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms operation called Fast and Furious. That's happening before the Senate Judiciary Committee on C-SPAN and C-SPAN Radio. And also right now, the Senate Education Committee is hearing from teachers about changes to the No Child Left Behind program. You can see that live on C-SPAN 3. And later today, we'll also have live remarks from Herman Cain. He's holding a news conference in Phoenix, Arizona at 5 p.m. Eastern about the accusations of sexual harassment. Again, that will be live at 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll have that on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Radio, and cspan.org. Congressional Quarterly is writing about something expected to come up in the Senate later this week. Congressional frustration over EPA regulations will resurface as Democrats and environmentalists look to fend off a long-shot procedural move aimed at blocking a recent rule to control cross-border air pollution. While much of the legislative pushback against the EPA has come from the GOP-led House, the Senate is expected to vote on November 10th, that's Wednesday, on a disapproval nomination, that's a disapproval resolution filed by Rand Paul that would void the EPA's cross-air transport rule. That rule, finalized in July, is designed to control emissions to sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides in 28 states that are blamed for poor air quality in downwind northeastern and mid-Atlantic states. That's in Congressional Quarterly.
Madam President.